You are, biologically speaking, a system with exactly one point of failure. Somewhere back in your family line, at some specific moment, one person was standing between you and never existing at all. Not two people, not a village. One person, holding one exhausted, screaming, 3-kilogram animal that could not lift its own head. Here's the strange part. Human infants are, by any reasonable engineering standard, a bad design. They can't walk, they can't cling, they can't regulate their own temperature. Left alone for even a single cold night, a newborn can die faster than you'd think possible. And yet you're here. Thousands of generations of one person holding everything together, and not one of those moments broke. So either your ancestors were freakishly lucky, over and over, for 300,000 years, or something else was going on. Something structural. Something that had almost nothing to do with luck and everything to do with a very specific kind of engineering, the kind you build not to make something work perfectly, but to make sure it never depends on just one thing working at all. That's the real story here. Not ancient humans were caring. Everyone already assumes that. The real story is that human childhood evolved as a redundancy system, a backup network, deliberately overbuilt because the alternative was extinction. And once you see it that way, a lot of strange, uncomfortable, occasionally gross ancient behavior stops looking sentimental and starts looking like engineering. Let's start with why the system needed backups in the first place. Human birth is a compromise nobody asked for. Your brain, at birth, is only around a quarter of its adult size. A chimpanzee is born already at nearly half. The reason is almost embarrassingly simple. Human brains got too big for human hips, so evolution split the difference. It kicked babies out early, before the brain was anywhere near finished, and left the rest of the construction project to happen out in the open, fully exposed, fully dependent. Anthropologists have a term for this secondary altriciality, but you don't need the term to feel the weight of it. It means a human child cannot survive alone, not for a day, not in the earliest weeks, for more than a few hours. The species solved the biggest problem in mammalian reproduction by making its offspring catastrophically fragile and then betting everything on the idea that somebody always would be there to catch them. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What happens when that somebody isn't there? We actually have an answer, and it's grim enough to explain everything that follows. Researchers who've tracked child survival in communities without modern medical infrastructure have found something brutal and specific. When a mother dies within the first 6 weeks after birth, her infant's risk of dying in the following month doesn't rise a little. In some of the most careful longitudinal studies on this, that risk jumps by roughly 40 times. Not 40%, 40 times. Sit with that number for a second. It means the single most dangerous event in a newborn's life, more dangerous than disease, more dangerous than famine, is simply losing the one adult it was built to depend on. And here's the thing nobody says out loud. Mothers in the ancestral world died constantly. Childbirth itself was one of the leading causes of death for young women for most of human history. Infection, hemorrhage, exhaustion, a second birth going wrong before the first child was even walking. So, if human infant survival had been designed around a single caregiver, the species would have collapsed under its own math. Every maternal death would have taken a child with it, generation after generation, and the numbers simply don't lie that way. Something had to absorb the failures. Something had to make sure the death of one link didn't break the whole chain. That something wasn't a virtue. It was architecture. Here's where it gets specific, and this is where the story really starts to diverge from the comfortable version most people have heard. You've probably encountered the grandmother hypothesis, the idea that human menopause exists because older women became more valuable raising grandchildren than having more children of their own. It's a real, well-supported idea, developed by the anthropologist Kristen Hawkes in the 1990s, and it explains something genuinely bizarre about our species. Almost no other animal on the planet lives for decades after its reproductive years end. We do. And the theory says that's not an accident, it's an investment. But grandmothers were only one layer of the backup system. And the layer that gets talked about far less is, frankly, the one that makes people a little uncomfortable at dinner parties. In parts of lowland South America, among groups like the Bari of Venezuela, there's a belief anthropologists call partible paternity, the idea that a child can biologically have more than one father, built up through separate contributions during pregnancy. To modern ears, this sounds like folklore dressed up to excuse infidelity. But when researchers actually tracked outcomes for hundreds of Bari children, the pattern wasn't folklore, it was survival math. Children recognized as having a second father, one who contributed food and protection alongside the primary father, survived to age 15 at a rate of around 80%. Children with only one father survived at a rate closer to 64%. That's not a small gap. That's the difference between a functioning backup system and a single point of failure. Now, whether or not you buy the biology behind the belief, the social engineering is undeniable. A society facing brutal, unpredictable resource shortages had, independently, arrived at a way to give a child two, sometimes three, adults financially and practically obligated to keep it alive, not out of sentiment, out of insurance. If one provider failed, died in a hunting accident, got sick, simply vanished into another relationship, the child didn't go to zero. The system had redundancy built in at the level of parenthood itself. And once you start looking for this pattern, it shows up everywhere, dressed differently in every culture, always doing the same underlying job. Take milk. In the world most of us grew up in, breastfeeding is thought of as something that happens between exactly one mother and exactly one infant, a closed, private relationship. That is very much not how it worked for most of human history. Across traditional societies on nearly every continent, other women, an aunt, a co-wife, a neighbor whose own child had recently weaned would nurse a child that wasn't biologically theirs. And this wasn't treated as charity. In a lot of these cultures, it was formalized, almost legally. In classical Islamic law, for instance, a child nursed by a woman other than their birth mother becomes that woman's milk kin, sharing certain rights and marriage restrictions with her biological children, as though a real family bond had been created by the act itself. The bond wasn't symbolic, it was functional. If your mother's milk failed, or your mother died, there was already a second source wired into the social contract, and that second source came with obligations attached. This is the part of the story that should make you rethink the whole "it takes a village" cliché, because that phrase makes it sound cozy, almost accidental. It wasn't accidental, it was load-bearing. Multiple mothers, multiple fathers, grandmothers, stepping out of their own reproductive careers entirely. Every one of these arrangements existed because a single caregiver, however devoted, was a liability the species couldn't afford. And the system didn't just protect children who were useful. This is maybe the most striking evidence of all, and it comes from underneath a small, unassuming pond in central Florida. In the early 1980s, construction workers digging near Titusville hit what they thought were rocks. They were bones. Over 1,000 years of burials, preserved almost perfectly in the pond's peat. Some going back roughly 8,000 years, brain tissue still intact in dozens of skulls. Among the remains was a teenage boy, around 15 or 16 years old, with spina bifida, a condition that would have left him unable to walk for essentially his entire life. His bones were fragile, he'd lost a foot at some point, and the wound had fully healed, meaning he lived for years afterward. Someone carried him, someone fed him. Someone kept him alive for the better part of 2 decades in a hunting and gathering society where every single calorie mattered, and a body that couldn't walk or hunt should have been, by cold economic logic, a drain nobody could justify. They justified it anyway, for 16 years. There's a second skeleton at that same site, an older woman with healed fractures from injuries sustained years before her death. Injuries severe enough that she would have needed real, ongoing help just to function. Long after she'd stopped being able to contribute meaningfully to the group's survival, she got that help too. This is the detail that breaks the purely economic version of the redundancy story. If the whole system were just cold insurance, more caregivers means more backup, means better odds, you'd expect the investment to stop the moment a person became a net cost instead of a net contributor. It didn't stop. Whatever this backup network was built to do, it apparently extended past strict utility into something closer to an unconditional guarantee. You are in the network, and the network does not calculate whether keeping you alive is still a good deal. That's worth remembering the next time someone tells you ancient life was purely brutal, survival of the fittest, no room for weakness. The archaeology says otherwise, and it says it in bone. Now, some of the backup mechanisms weren't about who was responsible for a child. They were about physically never letting the child's vital signs go unmonitored. And the clearest example of that is something almost every hunter-gatherer society on record shared. Infants were carried against a caregiver's body for most of their waking hours. Think about what constant physical contact actually does, mechanically. A caregiver's body heat becomes the infant's thermostat. A caregiver's breathing, rhythm, and heartbeat become an external pacemaker for a nervous system that hasn't finished calibrating itself yet. Distress gets caught within seconds, not minutes, because there's no distance for it to travel. Cross-cultural research comparing infants who are carried constantly against infants who spend significant stretches of the day alone has found dramatically lower crying rates. In the first group, some estimates put it at roughly half. That's not because carried babies are calmer people. It's because a body in constant contact with another body is a body under continuous monitoring, and continuous monitoring catches problems before they become emergencies. The same logic explains something modern parents are often quietly told to avoid: sleeping in the same space, in physical contact, all night. For most of our species' existence, nobody slept alone, and nobody put an infant to sleep alone either. Anthropologist James McKenna has spent decades studying this, and one of his central arguments is that a sleeping adult's breathing and movement may help regulate an infant's own breathing during a stage when that regulation is still unreliable, essentially acting as a live biological signal the infant's body can synchronize to. Strip that signal away, put the infant in a separate room behind a door, and you've removed a monitoring system that evolution had assumed would always be there. None of this means modern cribs are dangerous or modern parents are doing something wrong. Sleeping environments changed for real reasons. Soft bedding and exhausted, sometimes impaired caregivers introduced their own risks that ancestral firm-ground sleeping didn't have. But it's worth being honest that we removed a redundancy layer and largely didn't replace it with anything. So did all of this actually work? Here's the part where the story has to get honest, because it would be dishonest to make ancient childcare sound like some hidden utopia. It wasn't. Best estimates from Paleolithic and early agricultural populations suggest something like 30 to 50% of children died before reaching age 5. That's a staggering number by any modern measure, and no amount of grandmothers, co-fathers, or milkkin fully erased it. These societies had no germ theory, no antibiotics, no understanding of what was actually killing their children half the time. But the redundancy system wasn't designed to make death impossible. It was designed to make any single failure survivable. A mother's death, on its own, in a system with backup caregivers, backup nursing, backup providers, didn't have to mean a child's death. It usually still gave that child a fighting chance. In a world that offered painfully few of them, the system didn't beat death. It just made sure death needed to defeat multiple people, not one, before it could take a child. And across 300,000 years, that difference is exactly why you're watching this right now. Which brings us to the uncomfortable comparison, the one this video has been building toward the whole time. Look at how a lot of modern, industrialized childcare is actually structured. 2 parents, sometimes 1, often geographically cut off from grandparents, aunts, uncles, or any of the historically normal backup layers. No co-mothers, no formalized backup providers. A system engineered, by economic and social accident rather than by design, to run on a single point of failure. Again, 1 exhausted adult, or 2 expected to be the entire redundancy network. Their species spent 300,000 years distributing across a dozen people. This isn't a moral failing on any individual parent's part. Nobody chose urbanization. Nobody chose the collapse of multi-generational households or the disappearance of extended kin networks from daily life. These are downstream effects of enormous economic shifts that had nothing to do with what's actually good for a newborn's nervous system. But it does help explain something that shows up constantly in modern parenting research: strikingly high rates of postpartum depression, chronic sleep deprivation, and parental burnout in societies that are materially wealthier and safer than any human society that has ever existed. We solve the biological threats spectacularly. Vaccines, sanitation, modern obstetrics that collapse in child mortality over the last century is, without exaggeration, one of the greatest achievements humans have ever pulled off. But we quietly dismantled a lot of the social redundancy alongside it, sometimes without noticing it was even there to begin with. So think back to that opening idea, you, as a system with exactly 1 point of failure. It's not quite true, and it never was. Somewhere in your ancestry, a mother who might have died didn't take her child down with her because a grandmother stepped in, or a second father kept providing, or another woman's milk filled the gap, or a whole camp simply refused to let a fragile life become optional. Layer after layer of biological insurance, stacked specifically so that no single failure could be fatal. They didn't have antibiotics, they didn't have incubators or car seats or formula. What they built instead was something almost as effective and in some ways harder to engineer. A guarantee that your survival was never resting on just one person's shoulders. Somewhere back along that impossibly long chain, the system worked exactly the way it was built to. And that's the only reason there's a you here at all, watching this right now.